Lately, every new phone just feels fine. No real excitement, but it wasn't always like this. Remember when the iPhone X made every other iPhone look ancient? Or when the P30 Pro's 5x optical zoom felt groundbreaking? So let's take a step back and appreciate the biggest smartphone glow-ups of all time. And first, let's start with the iPhone X. If you look at every older iPhone made over the years, they all had one thing in common: thick bezels and a home button. It got to the point where basically every iPhone just looked the same. The iPhone 6, the 6S, the 7, the 8, they all looked identical until this happened.
One more thing.
It was the biggest leap forward since the original iPhone. It was meant to set the path for technology for the next decade, which is probably why every iPhone just looks the same now. When this phone came out, it was literally mind-blowing. It replaced Touch ID with Face ID, removing the home button, introducing new ways of navigating, as well as setting a new trend for charging us $1,000 for a new phone. But the phone was beautiful. Thin bezels, OLED screen, stainless steel, perfect size. And maybe it doesn't look so impressive now, but back then it was incredibly special. And it's still probably one of the best iPhones ever made. But Apple didn't stop there, because the iPhone 12 also made a lot of improvements, and it was one of the most exciting iPhones after the original X. For once, the base model actually had a nice OLED screen, unlike the 11 and the XR, which cheaped out and had an LCD screen, as well as these chunky bezels. It changed the design from the 11 having smooth edges to the 12 having a boxy design with sharp edges. Now this design change is very subjective, because on one hand it made the impression that the bezels have massively shrunk, which they kinda have, and it also made the phone look more attractive, giving it more iPhone 5 vibes. It felt safer because the edges dug into your hands, but it wasn't as comfortable as rounded off edges because they felt more smooth and softer to hold. It was the first iPhone to introduce 5G. It brought a LiDAR sensor which uses lasers for 3D scanning and helping with autofocus in low light. It also introduced MagSafe, which offered reliable magnetic fast charging, creating a new ecosystem of accessories that are incredibly popular and easy to use. That same year, they introduced the iPhone 12 mini, which was popular amongst the people who actually bought the phone, but in the grand scheme of things, they weren't really selling well, so they were just discontinued. But the iPhone 12 wasn't perfect, because it was also the year that they removed the chargers from the box, which did make the box a lot smaller, also claiming that they were saving the planet, but all it really did was make people go out and buy the separate chargers for $20. But it was nice seeing Apple make so many improvements, changing the design, adding features, removing features. At least they were trying. But let's forget about Apple for a second and let's talk about numbers, because the Xiaomi Mi 10 Ultra took things to the absolute extreme, going to war with Samsung. But before I break it down, we need to know why Xiaomi even made this phone. This was Xiaomi's 10th anniversary, and they wanted to celebrate by giving us the best tech possible. At the start, Xiaomi was known for being a budget flagship killer, but the Mi 10 Ultra was a statement that they could compete at the very top. That same year, Samsung released the S20 Ultra, which was hyped for its 108 megapixel camera and 100x zoom, and Xiaomi clapped their cheeks with 100x zoom, 120 watt charging, and 120 Hz screen, and liquid cooling, all bigger numbers to one-up Samsung. Xiaomi wanted to shift from a budget brand to a premium innovator, and this phone was meant to change how people perceive them. And they really rubbed in the 120 watt charging, because Samsung only had 45 watts, which is somehow still the case in 2025. And speaking of Samsung, do you think they instantly panicked when they saw the Mi 10 Ultra and began making 500 watt charging and designing 17 different cameras? No. Instead, they took a more logical approach. What they needed wasn't higher numbers, but it was to polish an already good foundation that they had with the S20 Ultra. The specs were there, but they were just unreliable. The new 108 megapixel camera sensor had autofocus issues, especially apparent in 8K video, which also had rolling shutter, which is this jello effect when panning the camera. And the advertised 100x zoom was just bad. But Samsung redeemed themselves with the S21 Ultra. And again, it wasn't about numbers this time, it was about making the right choices. The design looked much better. They improved the autofocus issues with laser autofocus, improved the dynamic range, as well as loads of other things that added up to make one solid phone that landed in Marquez's most improved phones of 2021. In a way, the S21 Ultra is what the S20 Ultra should have been, which is why it's not on my list. But if we talk about phones that got it right the first time, we cannot ignore the Huawei P30 Pro. 2019 was the year where flagships played it safe, except Huawei. If we go back to 2019 when this phone was released and look at other flagship phones such as the Galaxy S10 and the iPhone XS, they both played it safe with 2x zoom, which was pretty standard. But then came the Huawei P30 Pro, completely changing the game and setting a new standard for smartphone zoom. Instead of 2x, it had a 5x periscope optical zoom, something that no other mainstream phone has done before. And looking at this footage, it's not even close. Huawei is embarrassing the competition when it comes to zoom and even in a lot of low light photos. The closest thing that we've had was probably something like the S4 zoom back in 2013. But if you look at the camera bumps, it was clear why the P30 Pro was so special. It felt like we were getting a telescope without the downside of having a massive lens at the back of your phone. It forced Apple and Samsung to rethink their camera strategies, as next year was when Samsung released the S20 Ultra, which had a 4x optical zoom camera, and the iPhone 12 Pro Max had a 2.5x optical zoom, an improvement over 2x. I mean, they tried. And even up to this day, the S25 Ultra still caps out at 5x optical zoom, which just shows how far ahead Huawei was 6 years ago. Too bad they got banned by the US. They cooked a little too hard and got nerfed. But Huawei wasn't the only one making bold moves in 2019. While they were revolutionizing smartphone zoom, Oneplus was doing something completely different. Something that to this day made this phone one of the best phones they ever made. What a tongue twister. Meet the OnePlus 7 Pro, a phone that took everything that was great about the OnePlus 6T and cranked it up to 11. It had a much better camera, a bigger battery, faster charging, and most importantly, it had an all-screen design with no notch, no hole punch, no interruptions. Instead, it had a motorized pop-up selfie camera which would rise up when needed and disappear when it wasn't. Not only that, it was one of the first mainstream phones to include 90Hz, which made the already blazing fast OnePlus experience into perfection. This was peak smartphone design, as well as being practically a flawless phone. In fact, it was so good to the point where people are still crying over the fact that this design no longer exists, even though basically no one had any issues with this pop-up camera. So what's the catch? There is no catch. The phone launched for $669, whereas the Galaxy S10 Plus launched at $1,000. At this point, why would you not buy this phone? Sadly, after this phone, OnePlus stopped cooking and fell off into oblivion. They really had the perfect formula, and then they just fumbled the bag. Alright, we talked about the big glow-ups, but there is just too many phones to leave behind. So let's rapid fire with some honorable mentions. The Nokia Lumia 1020, when it came out in 2013, had one of the largest sensors on any phone, as well as 41 megapixels, which made the camera so good that it's still comparable with modern smartphones. The Xiaomi 12S Ultra was one of the first mainstream phones with a 1-inch camera sensor, bringing DSLR quality to smartphones, as well as proving that Xiaomi could compete in the absolute highest levels, targeting photography enthusiasts with Leica-tuned optics. The Pixel 6 in 2021 was a turning point for Google because they introduced their own in-house Tensor chip, shifting away from mid-range Snapdragon chips. It had a much improved camera, the first Pro Pixel model, a complete redesign with the new iconic camera visor. It wasn't perfect, but for the first time it actually felt like a properly finished Pixel phone. Google finally locked in. And finally, the Galaxy Note 9. The phone is so good that people still say it's one of the last great Samsung phones. And honestly, they might be right. It was one of the last phones that had basically everything that you'd ever want on a phone before Samsung started to remove features. And now I'm starting to get worried because we're not seeing any of these major glow-ups anymore. Have smartphones already peaked? Think about it, when was the last time that a phone truly shocked you? Not just an upgrade, but something that made you stop and say, wow, this thing changes everything. Maybe it's the Vivo X200 Pro. That phone wowed everyone, but once again, where did we go from there? Is this it? Let me know down in the comments what you think.